Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, joined this afternoon, or afternoon where I am anyway, by Frodi. And I am very pleased that it is so. We're going to be talking about a recent event of his, as well as looking, I hope, at the way things have changed since events that he's done in the past, his vision of what's coming in the future. I hope everyone will stick around for all of this. It promises to be very interesting. Please do follow this channel, Semiagog, as well as A Safer Space. You can do that on Odyssey. You can do that on YouTube. You can do it on BitChute. God help you. You can follow me on Telegram, on Twitter. And there's Semiagog as well as A Safer Space on at least two of those platforms. And buy my books. You will see links for them in the description below. I'm not going to go into the details on all of that because I want as much time with Frodi as possible. Frodi, maybe you could introduce yourself to everyone, but first off, please do let everyone know where they can find you. I've got your links, and everybody who's watching, if you watch it in the next few days, you'll find his links in the description below. But I've had some problems with YouTube. Actually got a channel strike for something that I linked to off-site. And I got that sorted. It was very strange, actually. They removed the channel strike, which has never happened before. But since then, I'm a little careful about linking to anything that's not like GoFundMe or another YouTube channel. So please do spell out for people where they can find you now and in the future, and then maybe introduce yourself for the probably very few people who have not encountered you before.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. It's always great to talk. I've been basically a little bit anonymous the last year or so. I've continued doing my own stuff, but I haven't really given any interviews or been on any other channels really, because I've sort of been I wanted to focus more on the things I'm doing on my own channel and so on. But now I've started giving interviews again, where I want to do that. I want to sort of start being a bit more active in that field again. So I'm very happy to be here on this channel, because I always enjoy our conversations. And I just want to say before we start that I am traveling at the moment. So I'm on the road. I'm in a hotel room, so I don't have the usual Wi-Fi connection. So if my anything should start acting up, just let me know and I'll try to connect a different way. But it seems like this is working out just fine right now. My channel or my website is gtkradio.com. If you go to that, gtkradio.com, it'll take you to the other URL. I haven't really sorted out getting it. But yeah, just go to gtkradio.com and it'll take you to the right place. And GTK is Guide to Culture, and culture is Kulchur. It's the title of a book by Ezra Pound. And when I started the channel Guide to Culture several years ago, it was, we talked mostly about films and so on, literature and somewhat obscure stuff, not really mainstream stuff, but it's sort of grown since then, and these kinds of projects take on a life of their own. But thus the sort of eccentric spelling of culture with a K, it's because it's a reference to an old book from the 1938, I think it came out by Ezra Pound. Anyway, so gtkradio.com, and most of my videos are on Odyssey, and it's odyssey.com and then /@GTK. And then the third thing is Telegram. Telegram is probably the place where I'm most active. So that's where you'll find my updates, daily updates, and so on, and all links and everything. So, and that's just Guide to Culture, spelled with a K, Kulchur, Guide to Culture. So those are the three things. As by way of introduction, well, I've been interested and somewhat active in dealing with the destiny of the West, or there are many ways of describing the things that I'm doing and that many other people that I'm talking to, what we're doing. And, you could call it right-wing ideas in a sense, but a lot of people feel not comfortable talking about it in terms of left and right, because it's, some might say that it's obsolete. I don't really think it's obsolete, but that's a different conversation. But anyway, yeah, so essentially dealing with the modern world and the problems of the modern world. So I've been doing that since the late 90s, So for about like 25 years or something like that. But over the last several years, it's been much more visible, active, and public. So my two primary channels of communication are Guide to Culture, the channel, and then also my conference, Scanza Forum, and that's SCANDZA, Scanza Forum. It's an old name of Scandinavia from the 5th century. So that's the oldest form of the name of Scandinavia that we have. So that's why I call it that, the Scanza Forum, because at least I started out being active in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, but since then I've expanded a little bit outside of the borders of Scandinavia. But anyway, so I've organized conferences. Since 2015. I didn't call it Scanza Forum in 2015. I didn't really have a name because I didn't intend for it to be like an ongoing series of conferences or like a brand. So the brand Scanza Forum came about in 2017. And that's why you will see the number or the year 2017 on the logo. That's when the Scanza Forum was founded. But I started doing conferences before that. So I've done a total of maybe 12 conferences or so, international conferences with speakers from America and Europe. I don't think I've had any speakers from outside of America and Europe yet. We've definitely had visitors and guests from outside of America and Europe. But yeah, I mean, we can get into any number of details, but the reason I think that conferences are important is, of course, that I don't believe that we are rational calculating machines that will just take in information and then come up with logical conclusions to all the questions of life. I think that we are social creatures, first of all, and that we need we need to spend time with other people, normal human beings, flesh and blood, and not just live online. So it's very important to have a forum and a platform for people to meet up IRL, even internationally, gather people from all over the world, so that so they can get to know each other and to get to know the ideas that we're talking about, sort of in the flesh, not just as some sort of abstract thing online. We can get into any number of sort of details about that, but that's the gist of it. So Guide to Culture and the Scanza Forum, that's what I'm doing and what people most of all know me for.
Yeah, just so our viewers understand, well, to add some context to that from the outside, I think Frodi is somebody that you should all pay attention to and connect with and follow, in the sense of following the material and content, not in some guru sense, because he is well, I mean, he's a Scandi, so there's a sort of basic, moderate calmness, certain responsibility in how you speak, a certain desire to be methodical and sensible about things, and I think that's very much necessary in the kind of space that we're all in. Not that I myself necessarily do all that well with it. I tend to be a bit sensationalistic and sometimes asinine, but that is not the case with Frodi, who generally has a very, very measured approach. I've never seen him ever, literally never seen him involved in any kind of drama at all. No kind of nasty, Fed posting or bullshit, or the kind of questionable things where you have to raise your eyebrow about whether somebody intends for someone else to get in trouble, these kinds of things. And when you're talking about someone who's putting together events, that matters. And so for people who want to get a sense of what I'm talking about, and I imagine most folks have already followed, are already aware of you and already follow you, but take a look at Frodi's last speech, which has been released from this last spring 2023 event. It just struck me very much as coming across as measured and reasonable and straightforward. It didn't involve any kind of wild-eyed, anything. It was just a very, very straightforward presentation of the issues and concerns that I think would be appropriate for a much wider audience than most of the speeches and things that we generally see are. And so I think that that's something that goes down very much in the column in your favor. It's sensible, it's straightforward, and it doesn't sound crazy. And of course, you're someone who is always talking about the need to keep the Jerry Springer right at arm's distance. And though I'm on the borderlands with that, I fully agree with you. So yeah, I had you on some time back, and it was a great conversation. I recommend everybody check it out. It was on nationalisms, and you came on and talked a bit about what was going on in Europe and the rest. I wanted to have you on to hear about these this most recent event of yours. I know that there was a sort of hiatus for a while there where you were simply unable, like the rest of us, to do anything at all because of the travel restrictions and the border, entry restrictions, all kinds of things, threw a wrench into the works of meeting, organizing, and speaking in person. And so that kind of gives you a gap of a couple of years, one that we all experienced in our own ways. But I have seen that, it's like if you're weightlifting, and you take a picture of yourself and then come back and compare it to another picture 2 years later. The distance in time often helps to bring some things into the foreground about what's changed or what has shifted. I'd be very interested to hear about your impressions in that regard. I want to hear about the event in general. I know that you had a number of very interesting speakers. That's another thing I should have mentioned. Frodi generally gets about the best of the speakers out there, in terms of not being fuck ups, being serious people with serious intellectual credentials who've not that that's the only thing that's important, but it matters in terms of a quality of guest. So I'd be interested in hearing what they had to talk about as well, what kind of ideas were shared, and then just to open the floor up to where we can now just talk. And I can stop blathering on. The last thing I'd be interested in is your sort of vision for what you think has changed, where things are going, and all the rest. So let's just play it fast and loose from there.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you for that. And I agree. I mean, you brought up a number of things that I think are worth commenting on. With regard to the events that there's been a break, absolutely. The last previous conference I organized was in Norway in November of 2019. So it's about 3.5 years that we haven't done anything. And not only have I changed, and I mean, not in a dramatic sense, but of course, everyone changes from, over a period of 3.5 years, but also other people have changed. Our society has changed. The nature of the problems that we face, they have changed, and the general atmosphere in society has changed a lot. So yeah, there's definitely a difference there. I think that in the year 2016, 17, 18, there was still a lot of sort of, shall we say, post-Trump presidential campaign energy floating around in a lot of people, because that gave a, in the on the right, the Trump election was really the only, that I can think of, the only big international event or happening that where the right, so to speak, was on the winning side in the post-World War II era. I can't think of any other event of the same importance. So that was, I think it's important to understand that, because it is usually the left that is winning all the time and the right that is complaining about it. But for the first time since the Second World War that I can think of, the tables were turned, and so people got a lot of motivation and a lot of energy, an energy boost from that. And I think that's sort of also the most important heritage from Trump, that it gave sort of a morale boost, and people were just energized. It was the Trump. I usually call attention to 3 events during those years, 2014, 15, 16, that really caused a sort of a right-wing criticism of the status quo, that sort of brought it to the forefront. And that is the Trump election, the Brexit election, and the migrant crisis in 2014, 15. Those 3 things just created an explosion in numbers of people talking about the issues that maybe I have talked about for many years before that, and people like Jared Taylor has talked about for decades, not to not to mention people like Mark Webber has been talking about it for 50 years. But that was just a huge thing. And so in 2017, 18, 19, there was still some of that energy going around. But I'd say that after COVID, and now 3.5 years later, that energy is gone. So there's a whole new thing. And also during COVID, for very understandable reasons, people started talking about very different things. It wasn't really only a focus on sort of the migrant crisis in Europe and the West and in America and so on. The demographics was also just the increasingly authoritarian or sort of tyrannical regimes that we face. And that's what has people concerned, and what people have been concerned about, and also the sort of the Davos class, what Renaud Camus, the French author Renaud Camus, calls the Davocracy. That is the rule by the sort of the Davos class, those kinds of people, right? So that has definitely changed. So there is definitely the sort of the Trump energy, and that kind of 2015, 16, 17 energy has definitely died down a bit. So it's not, we don't really have that same kind of forward momentum anymore. But I definitely say, and many people told me this who were at the event, that they've never seen such a high average quality of people, not just in terms of professional success or high IQ, or people who are well off or something like that, but also just in terms of pro-social qualities, that people who have social skills, or it just feels good to be around them, right? Because that's one thing that I emphasize with this social aspect, that it's not really just the logical arguments or the facts. It is the social aspect. Who would you want to be associated with? And I think most people wouldn't really have a problem being associated with someone like Jared Taylor, who is a Southern gentleman and very presentable. He speaks several languages.
Hold forth very well in French and Japanese. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, if you're selective about who you present in that way, that will also have an effect on who you attract. And I think that is, from my experience over the 25 years that I've been involved, and sort of what I've observed, not only in what I've been involved, but my general observation is that is where the right generally has failed. It's taken in a lot of sort of stray dogs, and so just try to focus too much on just, well, if we're right, we're right. Well, no, not really, because people will not just associate with anyone. So just the quality of people, that is very important. So I think that maybe in numbers we've gone down a little bit since 2017, 18, 19, but in terms of quality, average quality, definitely up. I think we're definitely moving in the right direction in that respect. So there is definitely there's a change in mood since COVID started, for very understandable reasons. Like I said, people had still, I think, in 2019 and in early 2020, before COVID started, or in the beginning there, that we live in a kind of a freer society than we actually do. And I think that with more and more sort of technological problems connected with AI or whatever, right, that we probably are going to see a society that is becoming less humane and less human, more brutal, and less sensitive to the concerns of the average person, because the average person has no power. We have a rule by these people who are the Davos class and so on. And you mentioned my speech. I gave a speech which the title is something to the effect that how a crisis of legitimacy will bring about the end of the current world order. And the argument that I presented, and by the way, this is available on Odyssey. We had 9 speakers, including myself, and also a longer Q&A. And 3 of the speeches have so far been published on Odyssey, and including my speech. But there are more speeches to come, several. Anyway, do you want me to give a presentation of what the argument was that I gave?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I found it very straightforward and very interesting. The only reason I'm looking to either side is because I'm going to I'm linking through here to your Odyssey, and I'm going to post a link to the video in the chat here. But please go ahead.
Yeah, the argument that I gave, and this is again, this is a sort of a, I'm probably on the right. I call myself more of a traditionalist than a right winger, but I'm definitely, it's the ideas of the right. It's a criticism of sort of leftist utopian ideas that I'm all about that. But a problem that a lot of right wingers have had, which has been sort of the downfall of the right-wing movement, has been a sort of embracing the negative framing and name-calling from the left. I mean, the left has always been setting the agenda, and the right has always been reactionary. So the theme of my conference was the year 2050, because I kind of wanted to call attention to that issue, that problem, that you can't just play defense all the time and just lose. You have to, have your own ideas that you put forward. You can't just complain that, oy vey, they're mean to us. Yeah, that's not going to do much, because they have an idea of where they want to go and what they want to do. And if you don't have your own idea, if you just say, no, I don't like what you're doing to me right now, well, that's not going to do much. And so my point was to just set up a more sort of specific discussion about where we think the West is going in the next generation. A generation is usually 25 years, so 2050, 27 years. So that was the theme, because I wanted to have a more of a setting goals rather than just talk about the problem. And so, like I said, my speech was about how a crisis of legitimacy in the current worldview or current establishment will bring about the end of the current world order. What I was doing there was that I brought up 3 examples of sort of cornerstones or 3 pillars of what the current ruling class proclaims to be, what they say that these are sort of at the core, these are core values of their ideology and their worldview. And the examples I brought up was democracy, liberalism, and one idea that Francis Fukuyama has called getting to Denmark. I'll get into more of an explanation of what that is, but that's what he explicitly says is the goal of the sort of the American foreign policy, and of, in extension of that, of course, of the entire West, that we're going to create countries all over the world that work sort of like Denmark. And that's bizarre for many reasons. But just as a sort of an introduction to why I did that is because I've seen so many times how people on the right have just been reactionary to what the left says and just let the left decide what's what. And so the left says, or the establishment says, or the ruling class says, you're anti-democratic. You don't believe in democracy, or you are a threat to democracy. Where and people on the right have just accepted that and said, yeah, I hate democracy. I want to tear down democracy, essentially, which is, of course, I mean, stupidly walking right into the trap, but it's also completely false for reasons that I'm going to mention. The same thing with liberalism, liberal values. There's a difference between liberal values, which, people in sort of everyday parlance talk about as liberal values, versus the actual ideology of liberalism. Those are 2 somewhat different things, and also the whole idea of getting to Denmark. So the argument that I make, which I think is a true one, is that, well, the current establishment is absolutely not democratic. There are many reasons, and I gave many reasons. Well, one of them is this thing with mass immigration. I mean, we have now a situation where major cities in Europe, where the native population is a minority. And the problem is that it's never been the masses or the sort of the average population of those countries that have asked for that change or that transformation. No, it's been sort of forced upon them. And when they have protested, when people have protested and said, we don't want this, then the ruling class or the establishment, the sort of the journalist class, the political class, the financial class have said, you are conspiracy theorists, you are paranoid, or you're evil, and this is not true. They've sort of denied the obvious, what's happening right in front of our eyes. They've just denied that that's not happening. That's not happening. And so, I mean, it's obvious that it has happened, because we have now a situation where, for example, London is about a third white British, the population of London. So, I mean, these are just numbers. This is just a fact. And everyone who actually lives or visits the big cities of Europe can see this transformation that's happened over the last several decades since the Second World War. And so, I mean, that's just one example of what's not democratic. I can give you another example, which I didn't mention in the speech. Sweden is now basically a 100% cashless society. You cannot use cash. I was at the airport in Sweden yesterday, and I saw an old man trying to buy a meal at the airport. And he came up and, to get his food and wanted to pay. No, we don't accept cash. No food for you. And, this is a transformation of society, which means just more control with the establishment, or the sort of the rulers of the society. They have more control. And this is, again, this is not a democratic transformation, because most people are opposed to this. I mean, people have been objecting the whole time. They've never asked for this. So my point is that the whole framing of the society that we have now, in terms of that saying that is democratic, and the people who oppose the current ideology, that they are anti-democratic when they speak the voice of the majority, that's just absurd. I mean, that's just the opposite of the truth. So that's an argument that I make, and I mean, there are so many examples. I mean, one other example that I brought up is the expansion of the power of the EU. I mean, the EU started out as a sort of financial cooperation between European countries.
European Economic Community, EEC. I mean, I remember it.
Yeah, exactly. And when people objected, saying, this is a slippery slope. We don't want this. We don't want to get rid of the nations of Europe and create this kind of United States of Europe, sort of like that is different. That's no longer different countries. This is just like an economic zone with this Brussels bureaucracy. But of course, they were also silenced or kind of crushed and said, well, that's paranoid slippery slope mentality. That's not true. Whereas one of the architects of the EU, Jean Monnet, he actually, there's a method called the Jean Monnet method, which is also called the small steps method, which simply means, okay, we're going to create this situation. We have to do it in small incremental steps, because otherwise people are going to object too much. And when people even objected, they said, no, that's just paranoia. And I mean, that's just one example. But there was also a situation and this was the, what's it called? Lisbon Treaty? What's it called?
Right. That's where they basically, they don't like the vote result, so they just keep doing it over and over and over and over again until they get the result they want.
Yeah. Exactly. This was in 2005, 2007, where they started out with a proposition, basically expand the legal powers of the EU, and people voted no. And so they just canceled the final referenda. They just canceled the final votes and said, no, we're not going to do any votes. And so they just, a little bit later, they just put a new name on the whole legal proposition and just did it without a vote the second time, because they didn't get the answers they wanted. There are so many examples, but my point is that, we have, so-called democracies where we have political parties who you can vote for, and you can sometimes have a referendum in a country, but those are usually for quite trivial issues. And for the big issues that really determine the destiny and the future of your country and of your entire civilization, well, you don't get a say in those.
Those are always inevitable progress. These things just happen. It's the march of historical progress. To attempt to do anything about it is like a man standing in front of a glacier and saying, stop. It cannot be done. It's always presented in that fashion. One of the most common ones that I see that with is, as I've made jokes about, on Twitter before, but, they talk about linguistic change. I used to bitch about linguistic change, and my family are writers and editors. And, my mother would always be like, there's nothing you can do about that. Languages develop. You cannot stop that development. You cannot stop that movement. And I'm like, well, what about all the words that we have to say now? And what about all the other words that we're never allowed to say? Would you say that, that's an imposition of linguistic standards that, takes no account of what may happen as developments? The presumptions behind this thinking that it's the ineluctable, inescapable march of progress, they crumble at the first touch, much like the points you're making about the claims about democracy and liberalism and all the rest. It's like, the idol with the feet of clay, or the emperor has no clothes. It takes really just the smallest amount of skepticism and attention applied towards any of these things, and it's like suddenly the illusion goes up in smoke. And yet, for reasons that still remain not entirely clear to me, most people don't want to do that.
Yeah. No, exactly. The idea about sort of inevitable corruption of language, that's a good example. I actually had this conversation just a week ago. I have a channel for members only, where we have these weekly meetings or weekly conversations. One topic that came up is the Faroese language, and I'm from the Faroe Islands. For those who probably many out there who might not know what the Faroe Islands is, what kind of place it is. It's a tiny place with just 50,000 people. It was settled by Vikings in the 800s. So it's a small group of islands somewhere in the Atlantic, halfway between Scotland and Iceland. So it's a tiny little place, but it's Scandinavian and sort of a part of Scandinavia. The language is similar to Icelandic. Well, I'm from the Faroe Islands, but I've lived most of my life in Sweden and Norway and so on. And just like you, I'm a sort of a language nerd. I read grammar books for fun.
Well, and you're reading Pound too, which is, yes. I mean, I guess you could go get a little more over the top with Joyce, but not much,
Something like that. Yeah. So, I mean, this has been something that that has bothered me, the sort of the leftist attitude toward language, which has been very pronounced in Sweden, because Sweden has the Swedish Academy, that it's called, is based similar to the French Academy, which is sort of the guardians of the Swedish language. So there are 18 people who are in this group called the Swedish Academy, and they are language professors and so on, and that's the highest authority on the Swedish language. And of course, 100 years ago, they had a pretty conservative attitude toward the Swedish language. What is correct? I mean, they publish books on correct usage, on grammar, they publish the sort of authoritative version of the Swedish dictionary and so on. But of course, in recent decades, they've taken on an attitude, which is, of course, from the left, which says, well, who can say what's right or wrong? Who can say, because, of course, I mean, when you move in large groups and hundreds of thousands of people from Africa and so on, and they don't speak pure Swedish, well, that automatically creates a problem where there's like a hierarchy where some people speak proper Swedish and some people don't speak proper Swedish. Well, that seems a bit fascist almost. We can't have that. So of course, they have to. That just means, just like you do in schools, for example, you just give up standards. That's the attitude. So that's the attitude in Sweden, where just, where people speak incorrect Swedish, and it's just accepted. So even if you are at university now and you write an academic essay then you can use language that isn't proper, and it's just as acceptable because it's just as correct as the old-fashioned, boring, dusty old way of doing things. Well, that's the attitude in Sweden, and it's said that that's just inevitable. Well, it's not really inevitable because, like I said, I'm from the Faroe Islands, and there the attitude is completely different, because the Faroese language, just like the Icelandic language, which are the two closest, it's such a small population, such a small language group, that it's very easily corrupted. So they have a very conservative attitude toward language. So, for example, when there is a new word that is introduced into the language because there's a new thing, for example, a computer, you can't go back to the Middle Ages and find a word for computer because it's a new thing. And so what, for example, the Danish do, they just take the American word computer. So that's what it's called in Denmark. Whereas in Iceland and on the Faroe Islands and so on, they have to make up a new word that is archaic, of like archaic components. And also, not only for new words, but they make the language more and more archaic as the time goes. So that whenever I go to the Faroes year after year, there's always a little bit that I don't understand, because it's like they go backwards in history, because they have such an
one step forward, two steps back.
Something like that. Yeah. No, they definitely have made it a cause to want to preserve the language in as old-fashioned a way as possible, because, well, if you go the other direction, then it will just disappear because it's such a small language group. Well, that's a long presentation, but it just proves that, well, you can have two different attitudes toward your language, and one attitude, the attitude of inevitable corruption of language, that's not necessarily true, because you can equally have the other extreme and go to the other extreme where you just make the language more and more correct and more sort of archaic as time goes by. So this sort of selective determinism that the left always has is selective, and it is
and tedious. Selective and tedious.
Yeah, no, it really is, because it's always what they want is well, it's just going to happen. I mean, it's fait accompli. That's just how it is. Well, it isn't, and that's another thing with the mass immigration and replacement migration. This is something that just happened in the years after the Second World War, which is, it's a blink of an eye. It's a tiny little moment in all of human history where this has just happened. So, I mean, you're trying to tell me that humans have existed for 100,000 years, and then all of a sudden, like in the 50s, 60s, 70s, everyone in the West just decided that, we've just realized that the only correct way of doing things is to accept that we should become minorities in our countries. That's the only thing. No, I mean, it's obvious that this is an ideological decision, and like all other ideological decisions, they could have made a different decision, which would have had a different outcome. So there is this sort of, there's this deception going on where they kind of want to shift the blame and say, well, you voted for this. No one voted for it. No one wanted it. Except, a tiny clique of sort of ideological fanatics, but they don't want to take responsibility for it, and they don't want to take the blame, so that they want to shift the blame and say, you voted for it. So that's one thing. The other thing is liberalism. One of the examples that I brought up is with 1984. In the book 1984, the protagonist, the main character, Winston Smith? Winston Smith. He works at the Ministry of Truth, and his job is to sort of sanitize news and history and so on to fit with the current narrative of the ruling establishment. So he has to rewrite things and to cut out what doesn't fit, and it goes down the memory hole, which means that you incinerate the things that no longer fit. Well, I mean, when we've just seen just over the last few months, but I mean, this is an ongoing process that has been going on for years and decades now, that they've, sensitivity readers, which is the new fancy word for censors, sensitivity readers have had to rewrite Ian Fleming's James Bond, P.G. Wodehouse, Agatha Christie, Donald Duck.
Roald Dahl is another one. Yes.
Roald Dahl. Yeah.
And they're
So,
going through the movies now. Apparently, they removed the N word from what's that one where Gene Hackman's wearing the pork pot hat? French Connection, maybe. Yeah,
French
but there's
Connection, yeah.
it's just anyway. Go on.
Yeah, actually, a friend sent me a message about this today. DuckTales, about Uncle Scrooge and those.
Yes.
Yeah, the cartoon from, I guess, early 90s, late 80s or something like that. Where, well, my friend has kids, and he got this cable TV package or digital TV, I don't know what it's called, but whatever, because his kids wanted to see DuckTales. But they didn't have access to it because it was only on the adult thing, because it was kind of filtered out because by the sensitivity settings for children. And it came up with warning labels because it wasn't inclusive enough. I don't really know exactly which details of DuckTales that didn't fit the current political agenda. My point is, though, that if DuckTales comes up with warning labels, and this might not be suitable for children because it's not politically correct enough, then I'd say we're in a pretty damn fanatical society, a pretty damn sort of orthodox ideology. And I wouldn't really call that liberal,
Yeah.
So, I mean, and that's another way in which, a lot of people on the right, they say, well, liberalism is to blame. Well, yes and no. But the point is, we're not dealing with liberalism. I mean, liberalism, sure, there's an ideology called liberalism. That's a separate thing. But what most people understand by the term liberalism, what most people mean when they talk about it, is kind of an open society with a relatively wide tolerance and open-mindedness about
freedom of speech and the rest,
freedom
which
of speech,
certainly
exactly
don't see. Yeah.
No,
the right to confront your accusers, the assumption that you're innocent until proven guilty, like all things that have been chucked overboard.
Yeah, exactly. And so again, I mean, it's such a foolish thing where people on the right say, yeah, no, liberalism is bad. Well, I mean, yes and no, maybe in some respects, but the problem is that I certainly, and everyone I know, certainly has more respect for the liberal values of free speech and so on than the current establishment has. I mean, with a normal society that, people on the right are usually routinely called extremists by the mainstream. But I mean, most of what we're talking about would just be taken for granted 30 years ago.
Yeah. Don't flay your penis and invert it and stuff it up into a hole cut in your pelvic floor is the extremist position.
Yeah. So. Don't do that to kids.
Yeah. Don't bring those rainbow dildos around. I agree with you. Certainly these things, the more simply, the more straightforward you are about presenting such things, the more obvious it all seems, which then extends to making everything that they're saying look ridiculous. And these are straightforward points. I don't think that you nor I haven't thought them, in isolation 100 times before. Everybody who's watching this doubtless has, but there was something about the way in which you presented it, and without getting hot about it, being very deliberate and just listing the things calmly in a sequence that I think really helped to carry that across. And perhaps that's one of the advantages of actually bringing people together in an environment face to face, like you're talking about. You get to present these ideas, talk about it afterwards. I'm sure there's the same kind of thing that I always saw with academic conferences I attended. Some of the best conversations are when everybody gets together for drinks and food afterwards, and sure. You really get to explore these ideas and have discussions with people face to face. I want to, if I may, ask you about some of the attendees and the ideas they set forth, assuming that I haven't cut off some important point you want to make about your own presentation. If so,
No, I
please
mean,
cover that.
we could talk about these issues for forever. So yeah, let's just go wherever you want to go.
Yeah. Okay. But first, I should point out, it looks like when last I looked, I missed somehow that the Dutton speech had been posted, but it looks like there's one up for Dutton for you. I've watched yours. I still haven't seen Dutton or Mark Weber, who you do a weekly, with whom you do a weekly show. So
Yeah.
everybody should head over and check it out. And I understand you're going to be posting more of these.
Yeah, like I said, 3 of them are out now. We had 9 speeches in total, and then I did interviews with some of the speakers. The speech by Mark Weber, there's an interview at the end of that. So if you watch that speech, you'll get to the interview afterwards. So I did sort of a post-conference interview with him, just like a one-on-one conversation, very casual thing. So there are some 9 speeches in total, including also some interviews, but we also had a long Q&A with or a panel discussion with all the speakers on stage, where we sort of answered questions from the audience. So I guess there will be 10 videos in total. So 3 have been published so far.
Excellent. Well, yeah, I'd love to hear about what everybody had to talk about. But before we jump to that, a quick question about language. I heard way back when from some of my Icelandic friends, and perhaps you can confirm this for me or tell me if there's a parallel in Faroese, but they told me about the need to create new words rather than just carry them over wholesale. And now, of course, this was back around 93 or 94. So what was under discussion then, or the examples that were given to me, was the fax machine. I was told that they came up with something that translated as winged messenger for a fax machine. And I just want to know if this was bullshit or if this probably did happen as they explained it. And the other one was for a pager. And I've always loved this ever since, because it seems to apply to every electronic device that someone can carry on their person. They named it apparently Thief of Peace. Have you heard of any such things? Does this at least sound plausible?
It does sound plausible, but I haven't heard it before. I mean, I'm nowhere near fluent in Icelandic. Faroese and Icelandic are far apart enough that I only partly understand Icelandic. I'm not fluent in Icelandic. I mean, I definitely understand more than what most people would who are not themselves Icelandic speakers. But no, I haven't heard that example, but it wouldn't surprise me, because these kind of new constructions tend to be somewhat eccentric, because they go back to something that's only tangentially related to what we're actually dealing with the new technological thing that needs a name or something like that. But no, it's definitely plausible, but I don't know. I can't confirm. I can neither deny nor confirm.
Right. All right. Fair enough. Thank you. So I see here that you have yourself, Edward Dutton, Mark Weber. Are you in a position where you can reveal, even before their videos have been released, who the attendees and speakers were?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I can tell you who they were, but when you organize a conference, you're sort of in the position of I'm sort of in the same position as you are, because when you organize a conference, you don't have the luxury to sit and listen attentively to each speech, because you have to run around like a headless chicken trying to make sure that everything is working properly and sort of take care of things.
It's like enjoying your own wedding. It's never
something
happened.
Something like that. Yeah. So I only heard kind of fragments of the speeches when they were going on. So I kind of listened to them properly only afterwards, now when the videos come out. But the other speakers were, let me see here. So it was I, Mark Weber, Edward Dutton, F. Roger Devlin, an American author. He has a PhD in philosophy. A lot of people will know him. Jared Taylor was scheduled to speak. He couldn't make it, not because of the event itself, but because of the, again, somewhat illiberal and not very transparent rules that the EU has of who they let in or not. He wasn't allowed in for something, whatever that happened in 2018. It's just like sort of Kafkaesque, bizarre episode. He was scheduled to speak. He couldn't make it. Guido Taietti is an Italian. He's an Italian author. He is a political scientist, and he's also involved in a group called Casa Pound, which is a group that is very much involved in social issues. Pound is the aforementioned Ezra Pound, but it's an Italian group. What they do is that they deal, like I said, with social issues, and one of the major things that they talk about is that, well, if you can't have a house, you're not rooted anywhere. If you just rent here and there and you just bounce around and you can't afford to have like your own place, then you can't really have a nation. You don't really have actual people that way. And the financial situation in Italy has been very difficult for a very long time, and a lot of people can't really afford to have houses anymore, or own an apartment or anything. In this group, they have sort of like the left has done in the past, with like squatting and taking over empty buildings, and so they've built community houses in hundreds of Italian cities. I don't know exactly the exact number of how many of these community houses they have, but they have definitely many, and like I said, hundreds. And they have gyms, cafes, places where they can hold events and so on. So they're very much into the social thing. So it's a very active group, very impressive group. Who else? Then we had Ruben Kollep. He is so the conference took place in Tallinn, Estonia, and Ruben Kollep is, or was, he's not actually anymore, but he was a member of parliament for the Conservative People's Party of Estonia. He was a member of parliament. He gave a speech, and like I said, we were on his home turf. Then we had Professor Helmut Nyborg. He is Professor Emeritus. He retired many years ago. He's actually 86 years old, but he is one of the most prominent intelligence researchers in the world. He's Danish. He's also an Olympic medalist. He won an Olympic medal in the 60s when he was young in rowing or canoeing for the Danish team. And he was one of the speakers. Like I said, he has had an academic career since the 60s, where he's been one of the most prominent intelligence researchers in the world. An IQ and also other personality traits, and he has been very outspoken against censorship in academia and what he calls intellectual fraud, academic fraud. Basically, that certain research results are suppressed, others are played up or just falsified, or forged rather. He was one of the speakers. And then we had also Timo Hännikainen, who is a Finnish author. He is a publisher, he has a book publishing house. He's a poet, he's a translator, he's an author. His latest book is a book about Stalin, which came out earlier this year. And I think those were all 9. I believe I haven't really missed anyone. So yeah, I mean, we had a great lineup of various speakers. Unfortunately, only one from Southern Europe, but there's a language barrier that makes it difficult.
Oh, in terms of everyone having English as a second language, just as a matter of course. Yeah. I mean, if you go to Italy or if you go to France, they will do things in their local language, and most of them aren't fluent in English. If you go to Northern Europe, it's basically in English because everyone speaks English.
Right. It's almost as well as their own language. So
yes,
just for convenience.
all Americans and probably Brits too have noticed that all Scandinavians. I mean, I've been told since that it's really not all of them, but most of them really just do speak English very, very well indeed. Dutch as well speak English as a matter of course. Yeah, and that's probably why we don't in the United States see so much with Italian or German nationalists or right-wingers appearing, on these shows and in our discussions. Another one that's very strange to me, which doesn't make quite as much sense because there really are lots and lots of people who in Germany and Austria who speak English. Perhaps it's not quite as widespread as in Scandinavia and the rest, but certainly there are many, many Germans or German speakers who also speak English very well indeed. And yet we don't see them much either, which is a bit
No.
strange.
Yeah, but they also do everything. I mean, they have their own sort of homegrown thing where like all their literature is in German, and they have their whole conversation takes place in German. Whereas in Scandinavia and also for the Dutch, a lot is actually done in English, and also in connection with the conversation that's going on in the Anglophone countries. So, I mean, the conversation about what's going on in America and the whole online thing and so on. I mean, it's very much a part of the same thing. Whereas I would say the Germans and the French and the Italians, they have their own sort of homegrown thing where they just do things in their own language, so they don't really take part.
Right, Denmark and Scandinavia and the rest, they're on the North Sea like Britain. They're Atlantic countries. They have seafaring traditions. They have the same sort of Protestant, emphasis. Yeah, I mean, in large part, at any rate. That does make sense. So
No, so I mean, we had a great lineup that I'm very happy with. Unfortunately, like I said, Jared Taylor couldn't make it, which, I mean, it's just,
well, I wanted to ask you about that because this is certainly not the first time we've seen these problems. As I recall, there were other events that he was prevented from attending in the past. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, again, but I think it's Poland that had some sort of issue with him, and Poland squawked about it, and then it became a matter of EU policy, which limited his travel through all these other countries. And the other thing that I wanted to add, which is strange because of how Poland has been so heavily represented further west as being, the most based and nationalist of countries. Now, that is not to say that there aren't certain policies and attitudes they have that certainly are I think I screwed up my sentence construction. That is not to say that there are not many policies that indeed are much more based, but they certainly do have their issues. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to throw in is you've had this before with Greg Johnson, right? Problems and hassle from the government, not the exact same constraints. But, that's another angle that I wanted to ask you about, hence why I'm bringing this up. I'd like to hear more about what happened with Taylor, but also I'd like to get your sense of how much this system is closing to shut down discussion, to cancel, to make congregating impossible, and otherwise demonize and discourage the free exchange of ideas of this kind.
Absolutely. The situation with Greg Johnson in Norway was a bit different. Well, it was very different from in a way, but it was different in the sense that when Greg Johnson was arrested, it was in Norway for an article that he had written, 10 years earlier about Breivik.
Yeah, and being misrepresented by Antifa, right?
Yeah. So exactly. So that was basically, they saw an opportunity to take an old article that Greg Johnson had written and twist it around, make it sound as if he was supporting this terrorist, and which he wasn't. I mean, anyone who actually read the article, which many even leftist academics in Norway did, they read the article and said, well, this was just a lie. I mean, the police made a mistake by arresting him. So, I mean, the difference there is that they took an article that Greg had written where he tries to sort of analyze the situation that happened in Norway in 2011. And he tried to understand it, and he worded things in a way that were completely misrepresented by the Norwegian left and the Norwegian mainstream media, trying to portray him as a dangerous person. And so the police acted on that, arrested him, and threw him out of the country, but later basically admitted that, okay, maybe we were just played by this rhetoric. Yeah, oopsie. And so it didn't really get any more long-term consequences. He's welcome back into Norway, and they, it's like they kind of slowly backed out of the room, and because they knew they pooped their pants on that one. I mean, which even the leftist academics in Norway have spoken up and said that this is just outrageous, the way that they've dealt with this. So that is a slightly different thing with Jared Taylor. So here's what it is. Jared Taylor is banned from entering Poland. He has not been given a reason why, and this started in 2018. He has reached out to the Polish embassy numerous times over the years. He has not gotten a reply. He has not been informed for how long this is supposed to take, or how long this ban is supposed to be, or why, what the motive is. And like I said, he's reached out to the Polish embassy in Washington, D.C. He's tried to, contact people in the American state and said that, well, I'm an American citizen. Why am I being treated like this? And they said, well, we can't do anything. I mean, they were able to do something with the black basketball player who was detained in Russia for some drug situation, right?
Curiouser and curiouser.
Yes, but either way, so he has never really been given a formal answer or any explanation. He first found out in 2019 when he flew to. He was actually flying to an event I was organizing in Stockholm, and he landed for a connecting flight in Zurich in Switzerland. And the authorities stopped him and said that you're not allowed into Europe. And he said, what? What on earth? And they said, yeah, we don't really know, but we see here that Poland has banned you from entering Europe. And this ban is from 2018. So they didn't even send him a note or tell him. They didn't prevent him from getting on the plane in the US. They waited until he landed in Europe and then turned him back. They didn't tell him why. But the Swiss authorities in 2019, when this was, they said that, well, this looks like a 3-year ban. It looks like this is a 3-year ban. And so, okay, he still didn't get an answer from Poland. But of course, the 3 years were up. And so now he wanted to come back. And again, he landed for a connecting flight in Switzerland, in Zurich. And the Swiss authorities stopped him again. And they said, no, you're not allowed to enter Europe on Poland's orders. And he said, what? My 3 years are up. They were up, a year ago, more than a year ago. And they said, well, they apparently just extended. When the time was up, they just extended the ban without giving him a reason. And again, without telling him. So he still didn't know. And so they turned him back. And he doesn't really know what on earth is going on here. And all lawyers that I've talked to, they say that this is probably not a legal way to deal with this matter, because the sort of Western style democracies, they're supposed to be transparent. We're supposed to have rule of law where people can say, okay, is this legal or not? But I mean, just an arbitrary ban on a person and not giving them a reason why or for how long, and then when the time is up, they just continue expanding it indefinitely and arbitrarily. I mean, that's not how the law is supposed to work. But either way, it's Poland that banned him, and the reason he thinks is because he gave a speech at a meeting of a sort of a Catholic patriotic group in Poland, which is a big group, and people take it seriously. It's not like some weird fringe. I mean, knowing Jared Taylor,
and the Polish government has proclaimed that Jesus Christ is the King of Poland in certain respects. So Catholicism is taken very seriously there.
No, exactly. So he gave a speech there, and it was right after that the decision came that he was no longer allowed to enter Poland. Now, the reason why this affects all of Europe is because of the Schengen zone. So the Schengen zone means that if you enter a country in the Schengen zone, for simplicity, let's just talk about Europe. If you enter one country in Europe, you don't have to show your passport when you enter the next country. So when you travel within Europe, it's basically like a domestic travel in America. You don't have to show your passport, right? So that means that if you're banned from entering one state, they have to ban you from entering any state, because otherwise it's very easy for you to just enter one country and then just go to Poland. So that's why when one country in the Schengen zone bans you from entry, then that just affects, you can't travel to Schengen after that, because yeah, that would just make it easy for you to enter Poland. So it's kind of a weird thing, but that's why anyway. So it has nothing to do with my event. It was a situation that was completely unrelated, but it's the Polish government that has just treated this in a bizarre way and arbitrary. I mean, Jared Taylor, I mean, for everyone who knows who that is, I mean, he's well, soft-spoken gentleman, and I mean, he's not,
and very circumspect, very prudent, very careful to remain within the law, very careful always to be civil. Yeah. So this is just a bizarre thing that just apparently now continues, and I mean, of course, he is. I mean, he thinks this is outrageous, as do I, and and the way they've treated this, So yeah, hopefully he can take some kind of legal action against this and get some sort of answer, because I mean, he's now prevented from traveling to Europe for no reason at all. Yeah. And so, what is your sense? You obviously had the stuff happen with Greg Johnson, which I think was shortly before all the crap went down with the COOF.
Yeah, that was my last event before that. So that was in November 2019. Yeah.
And then we see that these things going on with Taylor have just sort of floated in the background to dog him, and make his progress that much more difficult, in getting out and speaking to people. Do you have any sense now, having stopped events? What was it? 2019? You said was the last one.
Yeah,
and then and that now coming back in spring of 2023. Do you notice any differences? Were any major differences under discussion by you and your colleagues or peers at the event? Do you see differences? Did your attendees see differences and remark upon them? And if so, what were they, and what do you think are their significance?
I don't think that there are many differences in terms of events. I think that not in terms of states suppression of events or anything like that, or state suppression of free speech. I don't really see that much. I think that is more something that has happened online with deplatforming, which definitely has become worse since 2017, 18, 19. So I think that people are just generally have a more kind of nervous, careful attitude. But no, I haven't really seen any more repressive attitudes from governments. I haven't heard anything like that. The one thing that happened, though, with COVID was that whatever momentum people had before that just disappeared because they had to sit still for a couple of years. And it's always difficult, momentum is a huge thing. And to get started from zero again is just very difficult, which means that a lot of groups that organized conferences and events around Europe, they have just disappeared during the COVID thing. So yeah, there's a difference, but I don't see that the difference is really because of any, government attitudes or anything like that. I think it's more of the people in general have become more passive. I mean, not to sort of go overboard, but with lockdowns, I mean, lockdowns is a term that I mostly associate anyway with prisons. What do they use lockdowns for in prison? Was to break the spirit of the prisoners who are sort of out of control, right? Who are a little bit too active, right? To make them more passive, you lock people down for a certain period, and then they'll become more docile. And I think that's one effect I've seen. I mean, I'm just talking about my personal observation, but that's an effect I've seen in general in society, that people have become more docile since the whole lockdown thing. I mean, I think it's had a huge effect on a psychological effect on people, where they become more passive. It's really changed people a lot, and I think more than people at first notice themselves. I mean, it's changed me. I can definitely see that there's a mentality before and after, and sure, it's possible to come back after that, get back to normal. But I think for a lot of people, they're not going to be, if you don't have the momentum, you're not going to just get started again.
It's like
sort
people,
of like, I don't know,
like people wearing masks today. It has become habit. Sorry.
No, absolutely. No, I agree. But I mean, it's sort of like going to the gym. Yeah, I mean, if you go to the gym, if you're in the habit of going to the gym 3 times per week, then you do that. But if you have an accident and you have, you break your leg or something, and you have to wait for 6 months before you can go back to the gym, chances are you're not going to do it.
Yeah,
because you don't have the momentum anymore.
It's an uphill climb, a much longer one. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't think I'm speculating too much, and I don't think I'm being sort of overly sort of hysterical about the COVID lockdowns, because I think that's just an effect that I've seen, how it's affected people, and that's why I think it's so bad. That's why I think it's, there's so many reasons that that kind of attitude is dangerous, because it's sort of doesn't really take into account how people actually work. Or maybe it does. I mean, for the people who are more prone to sort of the conspiracy explanation, they might think that that's actually why. But my point is that, yeah, I mean, that you use lockdowns in prisons to break people's spirits. So it might not be a huge surprise that it actually broke some people's spirits when it happened in the entire society.
And indeed, they do it as a matter of course in martial law, right? And martial law is, of course, the suspension of all the liberal values that are so important. That's one of the things that, I won't go way into it, but because obviously this is a stream where I want to hear your thoughts on things. But I have seen many times that people in the West, particularly right-wing people, seem to fail to understand that we had a parallel system with martial and civil government. The military is its own thing. It's its own system. It has its own command structure, and it is the most ancient one. And I always call it the break glass in case of fire system. If there's a real crisis, just like the Roman office of dictator, where they're like, suspend all this stuff with the Senate, give the power to one person in 1 or 2 year increments. Can't even remember, 6 month I can't remember what the office of dictator ran for. But the point is that you need to have one decision maker, because democracy is slow and it doesn't work well in a crisis, right? So we kept these systems, and we still have them today. Everybody's like, well, I hate our liberal society. I think we should be much more uniform and much more militaristic. And I'm like, you have that system. Go join the army. And what they'll do is they'll say, fuck no, man, because those people just tell you what to do and they're not based. I'm like, well, that's what would happen in a system where you have no input. So, we have a balance with these two things. And of course, with martial law, you have this suspension of civil law. And the whole introduction of the "you ain't gotta like it" system of impositions, and it seems that has been much more deeply seated now, to your point, than ever before, at least in certainly my living memory. Well, did you see any sort of consensus emerge in your discussion with your peers at the event in terms of, what you guys see coming in the future, what the road ahead of us looks like, and not just in terms of sort of the more or less passive spectator aspect, right? Where you take a look at what's going to happen, you have an assessment about, well, it looks like this, and this, right? But were there any discussions about how we can best answer whatever it is that everybody seems to think is coming?
Yeah, I just want to add to the previous point we were talking about with the COVID and so on. I think 2 other factors have been quite significant in making people more passive, or sort of people have given up more. One thing is the financial downturn. I don't know about America, but I can tell you about Europe that things have gotten a lot more expensive. It's just more expensive to be a living, breathing human being. I mean, you can see prices going up in real time, and definitely travel prices. Plane tickets. You don't really find cheap ones like you did a couple of years ago. So there's been a huge transformation, actually, of society just in financial terms. I mean, and that might be connected with COVID, of course, because sooner or later you have to pay the bill after shutting down society for 2 years. So I think that has been another factor. That's just I mean, if you just have to get over more and more hurdles for doing something, chances are you're not going to do them, right? And so
Yeah, more expensive. And we see the thing about 15-minute cities in Britain, which has always struck me as like, I mean, I remember when, I am aware of the historical period and remember learning of it, when serfs were required to stay on the land of the manor.
Right.
And when the ownership of the manor, or even, for example, in the case of monasteries in the East, in places like Romania that had gypsy slaves, you know,
Yeah.
when a new owner came along for that system, the serfs or the, whatever were passed along as a part of the property. So
Yeah.
we're seeing this 15-minute city thing. We're seeing a push to have the automobiles removed. We don't need those things anymore. They're too profligate. Don't
Yeah.
need to travel as much. Don't need to eat red meat. You've got
Yeah.
the idea that people should be limited to protein consumption in terms of grams, not even ounces. So there is, I mean, the deindustrialization of Germany is just like. So yeah, I guess that is another angle. Perhaps we can well, it does fit into what I was just asking about the current circumstances, and
Yeah.
how we're going to deal with them. But I'm glad you brought this up, because this is another thing that I wanted to ask you about. What the hell's going on in Europe? And you've begun to tell us, but what the hell is going on in Europe that people in, for example, the United States might not be aware of, that we should know about?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think people have become much more black-pilled. To speak the language of the youngsters today, right? I think people have become more black-pilled because of COVID, because of the financial downturn. I mean, you can't. It restricts your ability to move around and do things when everything just becomes more and more expensive. And I'll just give you an example. I was on the plane yesterday. I was flying with a Scandinavian airline, and usually you can. Actually, I'll tell you this first. A few months ago, when I flew, I heard a stewardess talking to some other passengers. I just overheard it because I was standing next to them, and she said, "Well, because you can always take hand luggage. You can always take hand luggage on board, right? That's sort of included in the price. You're allowed to take some." No, she said, it's ending now. Now you have to pay extra even for your hand luggage, and that's sort of becoming sort of industry consensus. So that becomes more expensive. I was on the plane yesterday. I was on actually 2 flights, and I asked the stewardess, "Hey, can I have a glass of water?" Which, in all my life, I've always gotten when I've asked for that.
Right.
If I was on a plane,
You could get 3 peanuts, but
yeah,
water as much as you want. They'll just
yeah,
pour it to you in these tiny little increments, right?
yeah. And they said, "No, I can sell you a bottle of water, but I'm not allowed to give you a glass of water." I'm like, "Okay." And she says, it was actually a male flight attendant, and he said, and a bottle of water is 55 Swedish kroner, which is 5.5 euro or something, like $5.50 for a bottle of water. I'm like, "No, I'm just not going to pay that on principle for a bottle of water." I mean, my point is that, yeah, this may sound like a trivial thing, but when that happens in everything you do every day, it adds up, and it just
And no
becomes,
cash is permitted. Yeah, as
and
you
no
were
catch is
saying earlier.
permitted. Is just like more and more like dystopian in that sense. I mean, I definitely think that has had an effect of just making people, just shrug their shoulders and give up in a way. And also, I think the third factor, so COVID, the financial downturn, and also I think the Russian war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think has made people very kind of black pilled. It's sort of like, I don't know, like the atmosphere that you could read about in relation to the First World War, when people just gave up. I think that a lot of people have just see this as sort of the end times in a sense. I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but I think that there are just so many factors that when you add them together, also with the technology and everything, it's like this is not a world where we can like navigate in a normal way anymore. So it just makes people tired. It's exhausting to deal with on every day.
Yeah, it has an ugly, ugly trajectory that
Yeah.
seems to be increasing in its negative tendencies. particularly as regards the war you mentioned.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a certain point at which you have to say, well, what are the possible outcomes here? And, it's different for me because I, as a little kid, did have to climb up under my desk at school as a part of the drills for nuclear war. I was a part of the generation that first saw whatever the day after, and I think the British version was Threads.
Threads, that's a brutal film.
Yeah, and it's also rather interesting that both those movies were made separately but released around the same time as a basis to argue for changing public perceptions. Another subject entirely. But yeah, I came up at a time when that was a very real possibility that was acknowledged. I think in the interim, it's remained a very real possibility, but nobody really talks about the fact that, when the Soviet Union broke apart, there may have been any number of nukes that went to strange places. We just stopped talking about it because it was the global village. We're going to surf the web together, read Mondo 2000 and, get a great Wi-Fi connection in Timbuktu, because there's only one race, the human race. But now we've come around to a situation where the threat of this great power, possibility of nuclear exchange and stuff is I'm not a big believer in the doomsday clock or whatever, but you could definitely move the hands closer to midnight for this kind of shit. And also with the energy prices, that has got to continue to be a problem in Europe, I would guess, except we're not hearing about it. Is it still an issue?
Yeah, I mean, okay, now we're in the summer. So the worst time was in the winter because that's when, heating prices and so on go up. Because, I mean, if you live in Scandinavia, then it's expensive to heat your house in the winter. And I have friends who, you had to pay more than a month's salary just for the electricity. And then is the mortgage, and then is all the other bills, right? Because, just in the blink of an eye, energy prices went up 10 times in a month. I mean, you can't plan for that. You can't budget for that in your, private household budget. I mean, so that's just, it was just a shock to people. I was in Hungary last year, and they use gas heating. It was just sort of most countries in Eastern Europe use gas, and gas prices went up 500% in a month. I mean, these things you can't really predict or budget for that or plan for that. So, I mean, but of course it's fluctuated, and of course with the seasons, like I said, it's different in winter versus summer because things are, you don't need to heat your house in the summer in the same way as you do in the winter.
But even though it's summer now, the prices are still higher, presumably.
Yeah, they're higher, but I think that they've gone down somewhat. But I mean, you never know, right? I mean, so I guess we'll just have to see when in the next winter. But yeah, definitely energy prices. That's just one of those things that just is disastrous for people. Some people they had to just shut down they had to sell their houses. They had to shut down electricity. They couldn't afford to have the power on at all in some countries. And of course, energy prices. You have to use electricity. You have to use oil. You have to use all these things in producing goods, food, and all the stuff you have to buy. So I mean, it just means the prices of everything just goes up.
Right, everything. And for Americans, all the Europeans know this. Probably many of the Americans do, but for those of you who don't, like even 10 years ago, the difference between what Americans pay for, and it remains still a great difference. The difference between what Americans pay for petrol and what Europeans do, even 10 years ago, was outrageous. Like, I would pull up at a gas station in Europe somewhere and I'd be like, wait a minute, first off, you're selling, wait, these prices look high. And my friends would be like, yeah, they are high, but guess what? It's not for a fucking gallon. It's for a liter, dude. So it's a very different situation, and the pressure is coming down on people. And I don't even know what's happening to the younger people who don't really have any buffers, who haven't inherited anything, for example, so they can live in a place and just pay the taxes, but not have to pay a rent. They're just, and also there's a kind of psychopathy, a kind of schoolmarm, social justice warrior psychopathy that I'm seeing sort of appear in various, I don't know. It's always been there, but I was just visiting in France, and I was staying at one of these, Airbnb type places, and so I carried the garbage out one day because I'd been in there for a week, and I figured, oh, look, there's a big pile of garbage. I see that garbage pile there. That must be the place where people put the garbage, and then the state comes by to, or the municipality comes by and takes the garbage away. And I'm like, oh, it must be like America. That's where they put the garbage. I put my garbage there with it, and I used the same kind of transparent bag and everything that I found under the sink and laid it there neatly and tied it and put it on the day with the rest of them. I go out to have a smoke outside like a day later, and all the garbage is gone except for my bag. and it has a big sticker on it that like has all these check things, and I had to ask my French friends about it to figure out what's going on, and it like checked all these things that I had done wrong with my recycling and garbage and the rest, which indicated that they could not be asked to carry the garbage away.
Yeah.
So what is the civil society solution that they impose? It's to leave the garbage on the street.
Yeah.
I don't know. To me, it seemed very, very strange.
The French have a pretty aggressive way of protesting against everything they don't like.
They're hard. They're hard fucking core, man.
Yeah,
in their own respect. Okay, so yeah, I guess that kind of covers the general picture of what we see in Europe. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, but I'm still interested, in what came out of this event. What came out of the not to get into the private discussions of the people, but the general ideas, what came out of that? Where do you think we're going? And again, if they're assuming that there wasn't anything else you wanted to cover on the previous subject before moving on.
No, I think that's a good, as far as a consensus, I don't know that there was a consensus, but I definitely see also, both in terms of what we talked about at the event, and also what I've talked to other people about. I mean, my friend Gadius, he has his Telegram channel. He posted that, the whole gay pride thing. We're in June now, right? Which is Gay Pride Month. But he says, well, has anyone else noticed that we see less of it now? And I've thought the same thing. I've thought for a long time that this thing will just run out of steam, because what does this kind of like the gay pride stuff and all that, what does it have going for it? Well, the only thing is really some sort of shock value, like rebellion, and they're kind of being edgy and so on. But when it gets old, it's not edgy anymore. It's not rebellious. That's just the establishment. And it's not very inspiring, is it? I mean, what are they going to do next, right?
Yeah. There's only so much excitement you can maintain over a period of decades regarding dildos and people like running around in dog costumes on the street.
Yeah. I mean, you can only parade like mutilated people for so long until people start to yawn and say, okay, next thing. What's the next thing? It's not inspiring. And I just think that like my thesis, and I think especially Mark Webber's talk as well, is along the same lines, that the things I brought up, and the third argument I made was also about this thing that Francis Fukuyama says, we want to get to Denmark. We want countries to become like Denmark, which means that they're supposed to be prosperous, they're supposed to be safe, low criminality, low crime, high trust system, high trust politics, low corruption, and like I said, prosperous, low criminality, and so on. That you work kind of like a Scandinavian society. That's how he wants Afghanistan and Libya to work like. And the point I make is that, well, if you want more countries to work like Scandinavia, then perhaps you shouldn't get rid of the Scandinavian countries, first of all. I mean, that should be a no-brainer. But no, they're instead of turning the third world into Scandinavia, they're turning Scandinavia into the third world, which is another way in which, with democracy and liberalism and this Denmark principle, that they're just doing the complete opposite of what they say they're doing. My point is that, you can only do that for so long until people just say, bullshit. That's you don't stand for any of these things actually, which creates a very hollow kind of political ideological system, which just loses credibility more and more. And I mean, we saw today, just terrible news. I haven't been able to force myself to watch the video yet, but there was an Arab in France who stabbed 6 people, of which 4 are babies, a few months old. Okay, so we reached that stage. I mean, we've basically reached the end station now. I mean, this is where we are. And things are not going to get better before people start changing things. And so my point is just that this will just create a mass. I mean, the longer this keeps dragging on, and the longer this political ruling class and establishment keep doing systematically the opposite of what they say they're doing. I mean, they're creating a society where we're not going to have any democracy. It's going to be a very brutal, authoritarian, harsh society, because if you have a society that is completely dominated by chaos, then you can only rule that society through something like a police state, right? So the more they just create this extremely chaotic society, we're going to have less free speech, we're going to have less democracy, we're going to be more third worldized. We're not going to have this utopia that they say that they're creating. No, we're going to have the exact opposite. So my point is that this, as more and more of this becomes obvious, which it is. I mean, some people have been talking about it for 50 years, but I think that over the last 5 years and 10 years, especially over the last 5-6 years, I think more and more people are this is just obvious. It's sort of like the end stage of the Soviet Union, where, I mean, you can see films about the era, Eastern European films, and sort of, where they make fun of that, that everyone just pays lip service. No one really believes in it, Everyone just pays lip service.
The famous Solzhenitsyn quote, they're lying, we know they're lying, the whole sequence. Yeah, it's as bald as that.
Yeah. No, and so, I made the argument, I think Mark Webber made a similar argument, that these kinds of extremely dystopian visions, they kind of depend on that society will just continue in this direction the whole time. That is very unlikely, because there comes a crisis, and suddenly when a crisis comes about, countries will have to react rationally to some extent or other, right? And this kind of like idiotic way of behaving, you can only do that when you don't have to deal with real problems. And one of the arguments at the conference was made by the Finnish speaker, which was a somewhat original line of argument. He talks about the borderlands, which is in Eastern Europe now, but between Russia and the West, or the American empire. They're sort of stuck in between 2 empires. And he talked about how, it's inevitable that there will be a sort of national awareness when you put that much pressure from both sides on societies where it's not like a theoretical, hypothetical discussion. It's an existential threat. They're literally threatened by destruction from 2 sides, right? Which means that they have to regain rationality in order to exist. And when push comes to shove, and people actually, when their survival mechanism kicks in, then they have to start thinking more rationally. And I think that when, for example, now that we've seen with the war, that's just continuing to spin out of control. I mean, I don't know where it's going to end. I don't think anyone knows where it's going to end, because, this is something that Mark Webber often likes to stress, that wars never turn out as the people who start the war think. Everyone thought that the American Civil War or the First World War, this is going to be over very quickly. No, it drags on, and it becomes a huge disaster, and it's a disaster that affects a whole civilization. And the problem is that, when you get into a crisis like that, you have to kind of pull yourself together in a way. So I don't think that it's some sort of universal remedy, but I think that these kinds of situations will force people to change their mentality. So my point, and what I think will happen, and the argument I made, is that I think that this current ruling ideology that we've had now since the Second World War, I think that has already run out of steam, and it's sort of running on fumes now, and we'll see it breaking down in a very real way, and we'll see it replaced by something else. But the point is that as it breaks down, it does leave room for some more serious discussion from serious intellectuals and sort of other kinds of input. And so, yeah, I guess the consensus, if we can talk about that, is that things will definitely get worse for a while, but that also means that the more they get worse, the more they break down, which gives room for something else. But I don't think it's determined exactly what that something else is. I'm not one of these, some people call themselves accelerationists, as they think that, as society just falls apart more, that just automatically will lead to like the people like themselves will be influential. No. When society falls apart, the people who are at the bottom, they just get stepped on even more. Yes. I mean, it's not automatic that as society falls apart, that you will turn out on top. No, absolutely not. I mean, there are hundreds of different possibilities there. So my point is, I don't think that this particular development we're on now is going to continue because it's running out of steam. People are not excited. The whole sort of pride thing that is, people are just yawning at and like, okay, they're kind of doing it, going through the motions. They don't care. It's not motivating people anymore.
Yeah, even the left-wing people don't care anymore. They just look at it like, oh, just another corporate flag. Even to them, it's like, you're just ripping us off. Their usual, anti-capitalist kind of attitude. But the point is that, both sides are like, fuck off already.
Yeah. Who was it who died? It was some American top politician who died when they had like the flag. It was like the American flag, the rainbow flag, and the McDonald's flag on halfway up. A couple of years ago. You're muted. I don't hear you.
Sorry, wait, the McDonald's flag at half-mast to like commemorate an important death?
Yeah, it was someone like, who was it? It was someone, it became a meme because it was so funny. But I don't think it was intentional. I think it was just, just another, but it is funny because I think that's how people start seeing the rainbow flag. It's like the McDonald's flag or whatever, it's a corporate thing, and you go through the motions, but no one gives a shit. It's not exciting. It's not interesting. It maybe it had some shock value 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but not now. And so with so many things, when you just see toddlers being stabbed, that's not a normal society. That means, okay, and more people will, they have to just stop. They're forced to stop, believing in this thing, because it's like reality sort of smacks them in the face enough, then they'll kind of give up their delusions, really.
Yeah, and the economic aspects, the social aspects, and even the criminal aspects. I suppose you'd probably agree. But in any case, it's self-evident to me that there has been far, far, far more tolerance of that, even accounting for the fact that much of it's hidden and people don't see it. Nevertheless, a certain significant amount, and certainly enough to show that things are fucked up, makes it to the surface or makes it to the attention of the general public. And they have shown far more tolerance to just continue to take that. Just take it. But I do believe that the economic aspects, somehow that is the kind of thing you're talking about. Like when you go and see what eggs cost, or what milk costs, or or God help you, what steak, what beef costs. These kinds of things do, I think, come home for the average person. Like, I don't think we have that many people who are constitutionally inclined to accept, the bug diet. So perhaps the economic features. Yeah, and again, I agree with you. It doesn't mean just because people react to it that something good is going to come out of it. But
right.
There is at least, that introduces a forking path. right?
Yeah.
That's a moment where it could go one way. It certainly can get worse. But you know, the moment of war, so to speak, is when everything breaks loose. And it's that very uncertainty that you referenced that Weber was talking about, which is and should be well recognized. You know, perhaps there's another angle there.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that maybe I forgot to mention this, but I do a weekly show on current events with Mark Weber on my channel called Weekly Roundup with Mark Weber. And one thing that we've talked about is this new, I guess, system or law in certain states in America, I guess, where the police doesn't follow up theft, where you can just steal from stores.
It's just over. I mean, yeah, they used to have a financial limit, right? I think when I first heard about it in San Francisco, as if it was $900 or less, because you know, having $900 worth of your property stolen is, you know, no big deal. Anybody can tolerate that. You know, I'm like thinking, fuck you. But yeah, now it's extended to the point where they just don't even look at the amounts.
Okay, so yeah, that just means that there's no law anymore. And I mean, how long are people going to put up with it? They might put up with it for a while, but when your livelihood and when everything is threatened, then sooner or later you're going to react in one way or another, and you're going to have to start thinking about things a bit more carefully than to just like go with the feels and that's a nice utopia, we can dream in that. No, I mean, you have to solve actual real problems here and now, otherwise you die basically. Otherwise you don't eat. So that will force some ration. So yeah, I guess it is generally a kind of a black pilled attitude, but also in the sense that the system it's kind of dying. We're kind of in a sort of a late stage of the current sort of paradigm, and it's running out of steam. So I guess that's the positive side of it, that it is running out of steam, and you know, hardly anyone believes in it anymore. Hardly anyone takes it seriously. People go through the motions, but they don't believe in it, and everyone sees the actual outcome, the actual problems. So you know, they'll be shopping for some other ideas, and there are better ideas out there, and you know, we have some of them.
Sorry, I was muted there. Yes, indeed. So I guess it's incumbent upon us, and this brings us back around to your reasonable, measured, not wild-eyed presentation. It's incumbent upon us to maintain a certain amount of, you know, not superficial respectability, but the basic respectability that comes from not sounding like a psychopath, not being socially incapable of engagement. Again, I mean, I acknowledge my own issues in that regard. I'm not saying do what I say. Excuse me. I'm not saying do what I do. I'm saying do what Frodi says. The whole idea of being very, very careful, which I guess brings us around to your events as well, to choose people that, you know, people are going to freak out about having social engagement with them.
Yeah, exactly.
And you don't have to worry if you introduce them to someone else that you're suddenly going to get some just totally, you know, insane shit that alienates everyone in the room and destroys the possibility that you can put your own ideas forth. And that gets in the way of people seeing just what you communicated, I think, so successfully with your own speech, which was that there's nothing crazy about any of these ideas. Nothing.
Right.
You know, nothing, to your point about extremism. So yeah, I guess we're tapping some of the fundamental things that we covered at the outset. Well, I suppose I would ask you now, since I've kept you so long, I want to be as sensitive as regards your time, just because I tend to blather on. What do you have any sort of closing thoughts you want to share? It's one point, and then I would also be very interested to hear whether you have any sort of upcoming public events in the works that people could get involved with in the future, even if it's just loosely the idea that, you know, you'll likely have a conference at X point. So that people who are interested in what you had going on this past, you know, with this recent spring event, you know, if they want to come back around.
My closing point, which I could only repeat or sort of formulate a different way, is that the major point of my speech is that don't fall for the false framing of issues that the ruling class or the establishment will try to push upon you, because they say that they believe in these three pillars. That's not all they believe in, but those are three of the major pillars that they say makes them legitimate, and other people not, which is democracy, liberal, like free speech and so on, liberal values, and countries functioning like Scandinavian societies. Well, my point is that those are completely false frames. That is total gaslighting, because we live up to all of those three pillars of their ideology 100 times better than they do themselves. They systematically move away from those three ideals, systematically move away from them. Whereas, well, those ideals, that's kind of the society that we would create, or that actually existed before they destroyed it. That is like the normal, European style society, European style societies. So that is my final sort of, or closing idea, that don't fall for these cheap tricks, which far too many people tend to fall for. As far as my upcoming plans, I don't have any conferences, specific conferences that I've planned yet. I'm sure there will be more in the future, but I guess that everyone who is interested in that, the best thing you can do is follow me on my Telegram channel and my Odyssey channel, Guide to Culture, at GTK on Odyssey. So I put up, like I said, a video every week. Every Tuesday we do a live broadcast about current events with Mark Webber, weekly roundup with Mark Webber, it's called. Other than that, I postponed this year's Decameron Film Festival, where I have a bunch of guests on, where we talk about films. We've had it usually in April before that, but I didn't want it to collide with the conference, so I've pushed it back to the fall. I don't want people to watch films all summer. I want you to be outside. So I've pushed the Decameron Film Festival back to the fall. And I also have another festival, a sort of a mini festival, a Twin Peaks festival that I also want to do in the fall. So we're going to talk about Twin Peaks. I'm going to have a wide variety of guests on. We're just going to talk about Twin Peaks and the whole Twin Peaks universe, and what is actually going on. What was it actually happening in the third season? Yeah. Exactly. We're gonna sort of resolve all the mysteries there and dive deeply into everything. So those are the things that are coming up in the summer. I will continue doing the thing with Mark Webber. I'll continue posting my own podcast and my own vlog and writing and so on. But as far as conferences, we'll just have to wait and see when the next one happens. But we just had one, so it'll probably be maybe at the end of this year, maybe early next year, or something like that. But yeah, no, I thank you so much for having me on. I think this has been a great conversation. I always enjoy talking to you, and I think you're doing fantastic work as well. So it's always a pleasure to talk.
Very, very happy to have you on. I hope everyone will take a look now for your convenience and copy the links to Frodi's stuff that are down in the description below. If you're joining a little bit late, I pointed out that those are going to stay up for a few days, and then I pull them out of the description because I've had problems with links in the past. But Frodi has spelled them out a couple times in the stream. Grab them, copy them, paste them in, go to his various presences. Telegram, I see he is most active. He's on Twitter as well. I follow him on Telegram. I follow him on Twitter, and I drop in all the time with the things he posts there that he's doing over on Guiding the Storm. And and I've participated several times with the Decameron Film Festival. I love it. Keep your eyes peeled for it this year. It's great. Thank you very, very much, Frodi. It's a pleasure to have you on. And it's a great pleasure that all of you were kind enough to join today. I hope you will all, as I said, head over to these other platforms and follow Frodi there. Until next time, I am Semigog, and I am out.
Sayonara.